The M249 saw weighs 17 pounds loaded. The 100-round assault pouch adds another 4. Magazines get taped at the junction points, not for looks, for noise discipline. When you're trying not to die, metal on metal sounds like a dinner bell to the enemy. Your nods hang from 5.50 cord because the issued mount breaks when you need it most. Every modification on that weapon exists because someone, somewhere, learned its importance the hard way. This is what combat preparation actually looks like, not a PowerPoint slide, not a safety brief, real gear, real adaptations, real consequences if you get it wrong. Now walk through any garrison in America today. Soldiers on cell phones during duty hours, earbuds dangling from beneath patrol caps, uniforms so wrinkled they look slept in, grooming violations that would have gotten you smoked a decade ago, now ignored by NCOs too afraid of paperwork to say a word. The M249 SAW sits unserviced while someone scrolls through Instagram. The contrast isn't subtle anymore. It's dangerous. This is what Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saw when he looked out at modern formations, and he said something that hit like incoming artillery. Frankly, it's tiring to look out at combat formations and see fat troops. Fat troops. His words cut like shrapnel because they were true. Not politically true. Not institutionally convenient. Actually, operationally, dangerously true. Walk through any garrison and you see it. Soldiers who can recite every safety brief ever written. Who know the PowerPoint slides by heart. Who can navigate the counseling forms in their sleep, but ask them to field strip their weapon in the dark and they fumble. Ask them to low crawl 200 meters and they're gasping before they hit the halfway point. This is the modern American military, obsessed with the details that don't matter, ignoring the ones that do. The enemy doesn't file complaints. The enemy doesn't care about comfort zones. The enemy studies American weakness and exploits it with precision. And right now, they're finding plenty to work with. Combat requires precision that garrison culture has forgotten how to produce. The M240 machine gun needs a 25-round feeder belt, not because doctrine says so, but because when you're putting rounds downrange in a firefight, those extra seconds matter. The difference between effective suppression and getting your team overrun is measured in fractions of a second. Your magazines need tape because rattling metal gives away your position in the dark. Your nods need 550 cord because the issued mount is made by the lowest bidder, and Murphy's Law kills in firefights. These aren't unofficial modifications. They're survival adaptations. Knowledge passed down from people who've been shot at to people who might be. But try explaining that to a garrison commander who's never heard a shot fired in anger. Try explaining the difference between looking good on inspection and staying alive in contact. For too many leaders in today's military, those are the same conversation. They're not. The rot started slowly. Like most institutional decay, it crept in through the margins. First came the risk aversion. Every training accident became a congressional inquiry. Every PT injury triggered a paperwork avalanche. Leaders learned to protect themselves first and readiness second. Training got sanitized. Corrective action became counseling. Physical challenges became accommodations. The standards didn't disappear overnight. They eroded, slowly, quietly, one exception at a time, until the exceptions became the standard. Then came the walking on eggshells. Leaders afraid to correct basic deficiencies because someone might file a complaint. NCOs afraid to enforce grooming standards because suddenly they'd be the problem. Officers afraid to counsel soldiers because the paperwork involved in doing it correctly cost more career capital than the violation was worth. The institutional incentives had been quietly systematically inverted. The path of least resistance became the path of least accountability. And accountability is the bedrock that warrior culture is built on. One sergeant major said it quietly, the way people say things they know are true but can't afford to say too loud. We're walking on eggshells. You correct someone's uniform and suddenly you're the problem. This is how empires fall, not through external conquest, through internal rot. Command, Sergeant Major Dodson walked into a room full of NCOs and officers, senior people, the kind who've watched the institution change over careers spanning decades, people who remember how it used to be and have watched it become something else. His question was simple, devastatingly simple. Has discipline eroded in the last 10 years? Every hand went up. Every single hand. Not some of them. Not most of them. Every hand in that room, raised unanimously by the people responsible for maintaining the standards they were admitting had collapsed. These weren't disgruntled junior soldiers complaining about leadership. These were the leaders. The NCOs and officers who'd watched the degradation happen, and in many cases had participated in it, because the institutional pressure to look the other way was stronger than the institutional courage to hold the line. The room went quiet after those hands went up, the kind of quiet that happens when a dirty secret gets spoken out loud for the first time. Everyone knew. Everyone had known. Nobody had wanted to be the one to say it. The institutional cowardice had become self-reinforcing. Leaders afraid to enforce standards produced soldiers who didn't meet them, which produced the next generation of leaders who'd never seen real standards enforced and couldn't imagine doing it themselves. This is how readiness dies, not in a single catastrophic failure, in 1,000 small surrenders, each one invisible, each one justified, each one contributing to a cumulative collapse that only becomes obvious when you ask the people in the middle of it to raise their hands. Military history teaches harsh lessons. The leaders who understood them survived. The leaders who didn't got their people killed. Ulysses S. Grant understood something about standards that most modern garrison commanders have forgotten. After Vicksburg, his horse threw him. The injury left him in pain that was, by his own account, almost beyond endurance. He couldn't turn over in bed without agony. A modern soldier in his position would have a medical profile, a recovery timeline, and a stack of accommodation forms. When orders arrived to travel to Cairo, Grant got up. He traveled. He executed his duties. No medical profile, no accommodation request, no delay for personal comfort. Not because he was performing toughness, because he understood something fundamental about what leadership requires and what the enemy fears. The enemy doesn't fear leaders who are comfortable. The enemy fears leaders who function despite pain, who execute regardless of personal cost, who give their adversaries nothing to exploit. Grant's willingness to operate through that level of physical suffering wasn't about machismo. It was about reliability, about being the kind of leader whose troops knew, in their bones, that when orders came, the mission would be executed. No excuses, no delays, no conditions. This is what enemies calculate when they assess American military capability. Not just hardware, not just numbers. They calculate the human factor. They look for the cracks, for the leaders who make excuses, for the institutions that confuse compassion with accommodation and end up producing neither warriors nor genuine care for the people in their formations. William Tecumseh Sherman learned the same lesson at Shiloh, and he learned it in blood. His troops were green, first combat, veterans of nothing facing Confederate forces that had been fighting. Since the beginning, the odds weren't favorable. During the fighting, 2 bullets found their mark. Sherman bled, Sherman stayed. He didn't pull back to the aid station. He didn't wait for a medevac. He stayed on the battlefield, bleeding, and used what he called leader presence to inspire men who'd never heard shots fired in anger. He filled gaps in the line personally. The Confederate forces saw him. They saw a man who was wounded and fighting harder because of it, not in spite of it. They saw something dangerous. A leader who became more lethal when the pressure increased. The kind of leader who demoralizes enemies not through speeches, not through propaganda, but through the simple, visible, undeniable fact of continuing to fight. Modern garrison commanders struggle to enforce grooming standards because someone might complain. Sherman understood that troops watch everything. They fight like their leaders lead. If you show weakness in garrison, you'll show weakness in combat. If you make excuses for small things, you'll make excuses for big ones. The equation doesn't change based on the stakes. It scales, and the enemy scales their assessment of you with it. But Sherman also understood something that gets lost in the push for standards. He wasn't a yes man. At Vicksburg, he openly challenged Grant's siege plan. He used military theory and terrain analysis to build his case. He argued it professionally. He made valid tactical points. Grant listened to all of it, weighed it seriously, and then overruled him. Sherman executed flawlessly anyway. This is a truth that modern military culture has completely lost. Good leaders can disagree and still execute. Professional friction done correctly produces better tactical solutions. When Sherman argued with Grant about Vicksburg, that argument made the overall plan stronger because Grant had to stress test his assumptions against a serious tactical mind. The result was better decision-making. Sherman's disagreement was an asset. Now look at what the institution has built instead. Yes, men. Leaders afraid to challenge plans they privately know are flawed. Officers unwilling to speak truth to authority because their career calculations tell them agreement is safer than honesty. The confusion of loyalty with agreement has turned tactical discussion into insubordination and institutional groupthink into policy. And groupthink gets people killed. Grant's philosophy on doctrine was blunt and absolutely clear. Doctrine is not meant to be the only option for success. He fought battles that other generals said were impossible. He won campaigns that broke every rule in the book. He adapted to reality faster than the enemy could adapt to him. That flexibility, combined with uncompromising personal standards, is what made him the general that won the war. Modern military culture has lost both halves of that equation. Standards have eroded to the point where the people responsible for maintaining them raise their hands unanimously to confirm it. And the tactical flexibility that Grant embodied has been replaced by adherence to doctrine that protects leaders from accountability, but produces predictable behavior that enemies can plan around. The Tet Offensive proved what happens when enemies can accurately calculate your weaknesses. Viet Cong commanders didn't strike American positions randomly. They targeted units with weak leadership first. They identified those units through intelligence gathering. Poor discipline in base camps meant poor performance in firefights, and the connection was consistent enough that they could predict it. Modern enemies do the same analysis. They study social media. They monitor public statements. They look for signs of institutional weakness, and they find plenty. Soldiers walking around with earbuds and phones during duty hours. Leaders afraid to correct basic deficiencies. Standards that exist on paper but not in practice. This gives adversaries confidence. It makes them bold, and boldness in enemies costs American lives. There is a story that most people in the American military have never heard, but it contains something essential about what this institution is capable of and why totalitarian regimes fear it. Tadeusz Gaweda was a Polish boy who survived the Nazi occupation through a combination of luck and desperation. His parents were gone. Everything he knew had been destroyed. He was hiding in the ruins of Warsaw when American soldiers found him, half starved and terrified with nothing left. The soldiers took him in, fed him. The army gave him something he had no reason to expect, a future. He joined the airborne. He went through the same brutal process that breaks ordinary people and rebuilds them as something capable of enduring what combat requires. He proved himself, and he kept proving himself through every rank, every assignment, every test that the institution put in front of him, until he rose to become the Command Sergeant Major of the 18th Airborne Corps, one of the most elite positions in the American military. The senior enlisted leader of the force that gets called first when the situation is worst. From Nazi death squads to the 18th Airborne CSM, this is what the American military does at its best. It takes broken people and makes them dangerous. It takes ordinary people and makes them extraordinary through a process that is deliberate, demanding, and completely terrifying to authoritarian regimes that build their military power on compliance. China's military creates compliance. Russia's military creates compliance. Their systems can produce soldiers who follow orders. What they cannot produce is the transformation that Gaweda represents, the refugee who becomes the warrior, the victim who becomes the defender. That transformation requires something that compliance-based military cultures can't generate, the voluntary commitment of someone who chose this, who embraced its demands, who understood that the standards being enforced on them were preparing them for something real. Authoritarian and militaries fear the 18th Airborne Corps not primarily because of equipment. They fear what it represents, the alchemy that turns outsiders into apex predators, the process that looks at a broken person and sees the warrior inside, the culture that demands everything from people, and in return gives them something no authoritarian system can offer, the knowledge that they earned their place on their own merits. But that transformation requires real standards, not the performed version, not the paper version, the actual, enforced, consequential version where people who don't meet the standard are corrected, and the correction means something. The version that produces what CSM Dodson was talking about when he explained the connection between garrison behavior and battlefield performance. His equation was unforgiving. How can I trust you in a combat zone if I can't trust you? To make on-the-spot corrections in a garrison environment? This is the forbidden truth about combat readiness. It isn't just training and equipment, it's character under pressure, integrity when nobody's watching, standards when it's inconvenient. Garrison behavior predicts battlefield performance because they're testing the same fundamental quality. Whether you do what's required when doing what's required costs you something. In garrison, doing what's required might cost you a moment of social discomfort. It might mean correcting someone's uniform when they'd rather you didn't. It might mean writing a counseling statement when it would be easier to look the other way. Small costs, manageable costs. The kind that a leader committed to their subordinate's survival in combat accepts without negotiation. In combat, doing what's required might cost you your life. The question CSM Dodson was really asking was whether the leaders in front of him had practiced making hard calls under pressure, or whether they'd spent their careers building the habit of taking the easy road when the cost of doing right was inconvenient. The answer was in every hand that went up. The shake and bake NCOs of Vietnam understood this, even if they didn't have the language for it. They were fast-tracked through NCO candidate course during the worst fighting of the war, skipping the traditional progression that institutional gatekeepers considered essential. The old guard hated them for it, called them artificial leaders, said they lacked the credibility that came from going through the proper channels, showed them, in some cases, what the document described as undeserved criticism and disdain from fellow soldiers. Then Vietnam happened. Those same NCOs found themselves in the fiercest fighting of the war, making life and death decisions, leading men through situations that stripped every performance of authority down to its actual foundation, whether you could actually do the job. When the shooting started, they proved themselves the only way that matters, under fire. The institution's preference for credentials over competence had labeled them inadequate. Combat's preference for results over process told a completely different story. They earned their authority the hardest possible way, and in doing so, they validated the principle that Grant had applied to his own decision-making. Competence matters more than pedigree. The system confuses process with results. Results are what actually count when the enemy is trying to kill you. But institutional bias dies hard. The military still struggles with this truth, still rewards the process of leadership over the substance of it, still produces leaders who are better at navigating garrison politics than at building the kind of unit cohesion that survives contact with a thinking, adaptive enemy. The career incentive structure has been pointed for decades in exactly the wrong direction. This is what Hegseth saw when he looked at fat troops, not just physical fitness failures. The physical condition was symptomatic. What he was really seeing was the accumulated result of years of institutional incentives that had deprioritized combat readiness in favor of garrison comfort. The fat troops were the visible evidence of a deeper rot. Leaders who didn't enforce PT standards because it wasn't worth the friction. Formations that didn't push hard because pushing hard created risk of injury, and injury created paperwork, and paperwork created career liability. Safety first, comfort second, readiness somewhere down the list, after all the administrative boxes had been checked. The enemy doesn't have that list. The enemy has one priority: find your weakness and exploit it. And a military culture that has organized itself around minimizing friction, managing feelings, and protecting leaders from accountability has produced weaknesses in every formation. First Lieutenant Grewalski delivered what might be the most important statement in this entire conversation. Simple words, devastating implications. Hypocrisy will instantly kill a command climate. Think about what that means in practical terms. You have leaders who demand standards from their subordinates while accepting mediocrity from themselves. Leaders who enforce grooming violations for junior enlisted while their own uniform is somehow exempt. Leaders who talk about physical fitness standards while their own PT score wouldn't pass. Leaders who lecture about standards in the morning and demonstrate through their own behavior all afternoon that the lecture was performance rather than conviction. Troops watch everything. They process the gap between what leaders say and what leaders do with extraordinary precision. And when they see hypocrisy, they don't just lose respect for that individual leader. They lose faith in the standards themselves. If the standard is real, it applies to everyone. If it only applies to some people, it's not a standard. It's a preference, and preferences don't create the kind of unit cohesion that holds together under enemy contact. The enemy watches for this. During Tet, Viet Cong commanders targeted units with weak command climates because they knew what weak leadership predicted about performance under pressure. Modern adversaries have access to social media, open source intelligence, and decades of observed American garrison behavior. They see the hypocrisy. They calculate its implications. They plan accordingly. When enemies see American forces that maintain real standards consistently from leaders who model what they demand, they respond differently. They plan more carefully. They allocate more resources. They show respect through their tactical preparations. That respect, expressed through increased caution and more careful planning, is the most honest feedback available about whether a unit's standards are real. The 18th Airborne Corps generates that response because the transformation it represents is real. The standards that produce Tadeusz Guerra's rise from refugee to senior enlisted warrior of an elite corps are real, and enemies who understand military culture can see the difference between an institution built on real standards and one built on performed ones. The pendulum is swinging back. Hegseth's directive to end the poisonous culture of risk aversion acknowledges the problem in the clearest possible institutional terms. The era of ridiculous shaving profiles granted for reasons that had nothing to do with medical necessity is ending. Medical accommodations are going to require actual medical justification. Novel concept, but there it is. Drill sergeants are being empowered to use physical contact and profanity to create the stress inoculation that training requires. Shark attacks are returning to basic training. Bay toss methods are coming back. Physical challenges designed to separate people who want to serve from people who want to be served are being reintroduced into a training pipeline that had been systematically stripped of genuine difficulty. None of this is cruelty for its own sake. Every person who has actually been in a firefight understands why it matters. Combat is cruel. The enemy is cruel. Training that doesn't prepare soldiers for that reality isn't humane. It's criminal negligence dressed up as compassion. Physical stress in training inoculates against physical stress in combat. Controlled discomfort in a training environment builds the mental architecture that allows people to function when the discomfort is not controlled and the stakes are not simulated. Pain in training prevents death in battle. This was true when the Army trained soldiers who fought at Shiloh. It was true when the Shake and Bake NCOs went through their accelerated training and then proved themselves in Vietnam's worst fighting. It's still true. The change isn't complete. The rot runs deep. Decades of institutional cowardice don't disappear because of a directive. The leaders who built careers on managing feelings instead of building fighters are still in their positions. The NCOs who learned to look the other way are still in the formations. The habits built over years of systematic accommodation don't reverse overnight, but the signals are clear. Commanders are being told to enforce standards and meaning it. NCOs are being empowered to make corrections without treating it as a career-ending move. The walking on eggshells era is being explicitly called out as the readiness catastrophe it was by the civilian leadership of the Defense Department in language that doesn't leave much room for institutional interpretation. The enemy is watching this transition. They see the pendulum swinging back toward traditional military culture, and they're calculating whether it's real or performed. Some will test the new resolve. They'll probe for weakness. Look for signs that the change is cosmetic rather than fundamental. Others will adjust their planning assumptions, allocate more resources against American forces, and begin showing through their tactical preparations the kind of respect that only gets shown to forces taken seriously. Both responses validate why the change matters. Grant understood pain compliance, what it demanded of a leader, and what it communicated to everyone watching. Sherman understood bleeding leadership, staying on the battlefield when the situation said stop, and what that communicated to troops who were about to face their first real contact. CSM Dodson understood the trust equation between garrison behavior and battlefield performance, and had the moral courage to ask the question that made every hand in the room go up. Tadeusz Gaweda understood, in ways most people never will, what it means when a military institution lives up to the transformation it promises, when it takes a broken person and actually makes them dangerous. And First Lieutenant Growalski understood that all of it means nothing if the leaders demanding it won't live it themselves. Hypocrisy kills command climate, every exception made for senior leaders, while junior soldiers are held to a different standard, is a withdrawal from the institutional credibility account. At some point, the account goes negative, and troops stop following because they've stopped believing that the standard means anything. The forbidden tactic isn't technical innovation. It's not a new weapon system or a classified operational concept. It's moral courage applied consistently, the courage to enforce standards when enforcement costs something, the courage to correct violations when the person being corrected might complain, the courage to maintain physical requirements when meeting them is hard, the courage to demand of yourself what you demand of the people following you every day, in front of everyone watching. This is what the enemy fears about American military culture at full strength, not the equipment, not the numbers, the process, the transformation, the alchemy that takes ordinary people, puts them through something genuinely difficult, and produces warriors who've been tested and know they've been tested, who carry that knowledge into combat and draw on it when the situation says quit. The institution is starting to remember this. The culture of excellence that produced the warriors who won World War II, that held the line through the grinding attrition of Korea, that eventually produced the NCO Corps that rebuilt the post-Vietnam military into something formidable again, that culture is reviving, slowly, against significant institutional resistance. But the signals are unmistakable. Has discipline eroded in the last 10 years? Every hand went up. The silence broke. The truth was in the room. Now comes the harder part. Not asking the question, living the answer, every day, in every garrison, in every formation, from every leader who understands that the soldiers behind them will fight the way they've been led and trained, and that the enemy is watching to see whether that's good news or bad news. The sound of change echoes through formations. NCOs correcting violations without apology. Officers enforcing standards without exception. Leaders modeling the behavior they demand from subordinates, not because someone is watching, but because someone always is, and because the alternative is hypocrisy. And hypocrisy kills command climate. And a dead command climate means soldiers who aren't ready. And soldiers who aren't ready means enemy commanders who are bold. Grant would recognize what's happening. Sherman would approve. CSM Dodson would be watching the hands to see if they stay down this time. The institution is remembering what made it feared, what made it great, what it owes to the soldiers inside it, and to the next generation of refugees and ordinary people who will walk through its gates looking for transformation. The transformation has to be real. The standards have to mean something. The leaders have to live what they enforce. There is no shortcut to the result that Tadeusz Gaweda's career represents. No substitute for the genuine article. The enemy knows the difference. The troops know the difference. The question is whether the institution is ready to remember it too, and act like it every day, starting now. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching. Thanks for